Richard stared out of his office window at the busy city below. Cars moved like tiny ants on the streets 40 floors down. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, but he barely noticed. His mind was somewhere else entirely. On his desk sat a resignation letter, the third one this month. Another nanny had quit, and this time she didn't even wait to give 2 weeks' notice. She just packed her bags and left while Richard was in a morning meeting. The note was short and cold. "I can't handle this anymore. I'm sorry." Richard crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked at his watch. 6:30. His son would be hungry soon, and there was no one there to help him eat dinner. At 51 years old, Richard had built one of the biggest technology companies in the country. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. People called him brilliant. Magazines put his face on their covers. But right now, he felt like the biggest failure in the world. 3 years ago, everything changed when his wife, Linda, passed away from cancer. She had been the heart of their family, the one who knew exactly how to care for their son, Tommy. Tommy was 12 years old and had cerebral palsy, which made simple things like eating, walking, and talking much harder for him. Linda had a special way with Tommy. She could calm him down when he was frustrated, make him laugh when he was sad, and somehow always knew what he needed. After Linda died, Richard thought money could solve everything. He hired the best nannies money could buy. He found specialists and therapists. He bought expensive equipment and turned their house into something that looked more like a medical facility than a home. But nothing worked the way it should. The first nanny lasted 2 months. She was nice enough, but she treated Tommy like a patient instead of a kid. She spoke to him in a baby voice, even though Tommy was smart and understood everything perfectly. When Tommy got frustrated and knocked over his juice cup, she would sigh loudly and clean it up without saying a word to him. The second nanny was stricter. She had worked with disabled children before and came with great references, but she had so many rules. Tommy couldn't watch cartoons because they were too stimulating. He couldn't have his favorite cookies because they weren't nutritionally optimal. She turned every day into a rigid schedule that left no room for fun or spontaneity. Tommy started having more bad days than good ones. This latest nanny seemed promising at first. She was younger and more energetic, but after just 3 weeks, she clearly couldn't handle the challenges. Yesterday, Tommy had a particularly difficult day. His muscles were tighter than usual, making it hard for him to control his movements. When she tried to feed him lunch, he accidentally knocked the spoon out of her hand, sending soup flying across the kitchen. Instead of understanding that it wasn't his fault, she got visibly frustrated. Tommy could sense her annoyance, which made him more upset, which made everything worse. Richard knew he was asking a lot from these caregivers. Tommy needed help with almost everything. Eating took patience because his hands didn't always do what his brain wanted them to do. He used a wheelchair to get around, which meant someone had to help him transfer in and out of it several times a day. Communication could be challenging too. Tommy was incredibly smart, but his speech wasn't always clear, especially when he got excited or upset. But what bothered Richard most wasn't the physical challenges. It was that none of these caregivers seemed to see Tommy as just a regular kid who happened to need extra help. They saw a list of problems to manage instead of a boy who loved superhero movies, got excited about pizza parties, and had the best sense of humor of anyone Richard knew. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "The agency says they can send someone new next week. Should I confirm?" He stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Let me think about it." He was tired of strangers coming into their home, tired of explaining Tommy's routines over and over again, tired of hoping this time would be different. Most of all, he was tired of seeing the disappointment in Tommy's eyes every time another caregiver gave up on him. Richard had been so focused on finding the perfect professional solution that he'd forgotten something important. Before Linda got sick, their happiest times as a family weren't during therapy sessions or medical appointments. They were during ordinary moments. Saturday morning breakfast, trips to the bookstore, watching movies together on the couch. Maybe what Tommy needed wasn't another highly trained specialist. Maybe he just needed his dad to step up and figure out how to be the parent Linda would have wanted him to be. But Richard honestly didn't know where to start. Running a billion-dollar company felt easier than figuring out how to help his son eat a sandwich without getting frustrated. He thought about his own childhood. His father had worked long hours too, but somehow his mom made everything seem effortless. She never treated daily tasks like eating or getting dressed like major productions. She just made them part of life. But his mom never had to deal with the extra challenges that came with Tommy's condition. Richard realized he'd been hiding behind his work, convincing himself that providing financial security was the same as being a good father. He told himself that hiring professionals was the responsible thing to do. But maybe Tommy didn't need another professional. Maybe he just needed more time with the one person who would never give up on him. Looking at his calendar, Richard saw weeks full of meetings, conference calls, and business trips. His company would survive if he stepped back a little. His executives were capable of handling things without him micromanaging every decision. But Tommy wouldn't get these years back. He was growing up and Richard was missing it. That night, Richard made a decision. Instead of calling the agency for another nanny, he would clear his schedule for the next few weeks. He would figure out how to take care of his son himself, at least until he could find a better solution. It scared him more than any business deal ever had, but it also felt like the first right decision he'd made in months. He walked down the hall to Tommy's room. His son was lying in bed reading a comic book with a small flashlight. When he saw his dad in the doorway, Tommy smiled. "Hey, buddy," Richard said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How would you feel about hanging out with me tomorrow? Just the two of us." Tommy's face lit up in a way Richard hadn't seen in weeks. "Really? No new nanny?" "No new nanny," Richard confirmed. "Just us. We can do whatever you want." For the first time in months, Richard felt like maybe, just maybe, he was on the right track. The next morning, Richard woke up with butterflies in his stomach. He hadn't felt this nervous since his first big business presentation 20 years ago. But this was different. This was about his son, and the stakes felt much higher than any corporate deal. Tommy was already awake when Richard knocked on his bedroom door. The 12-year-old was sitting up in bed, still in his pajamas, but his eyes were bright with excitement. "Dad, are we really going out today? Just us?" Tommy asked, his words a little unclear but full of hope. "Absolutely," Richard said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Where would you like to go?" Tommy thought for a moment. "Can we go somewhere normal? Like where regular families go?" The question hit Richard harder than he expected. When was the last time they'd done something normal together? Most of their outings were to medical appointments or therapy sessions. Even their meals were usually delivered by expensive catering services or prepared by whoever was taking care of Tommy that week. "Normal sounds perfect," Richard said. "How about we start with breakfast?" Getting Tommy ready took longer than Richard remembered. His son needed help getting dressed, and transferring from the bed to his wheelchair required patience. Richard felt clumsy at first, but Tommy was encouraging, even making jokes when his dad struggled with the wheelchair brakes. "Don't worry, Dad," Tommy said with a grin. "I'm not going anywhere fast." They decided to drive around and find a place that looked welcoming. Richard's usual instinct would have been to go to the Four Seasons or some other five-star hotel restaurant. But today, he wanted to follow Tommy's lead about going somewhere normal. After driving for 20 minutes, they spotted a small diner called Bella's Kitchen. It had a red and white checkered sign and flowers in the window boxes. A few families were going in and out, and it looked friendly and unpretentious. "How about here?" Richard asked. "It looks nice," Tommy said, "and it smells like pancakes." The parking lot was mostly full, which Richard took as a good sign. He helped Tommy out of the car and into his wheelchair, then wheeled him toward the entrance. As they approached the door, Richard noticed a small ramp off to the side. Someone had clearly thought about making the place accessible. Inside, the diner was cozy and warm. The walls were covered with local high school photos and community event flyers. Most of the tables were occupied by families, elderly couples, and a few people eating alone while reading newspapers. Soft music played in the background, and the Igoi Whole place had a comfortable lived-in feeling. A teenage hostess greeted them at the entrance. She glanced at Tommy's wheelchair for just a second, then smiled normally. "Good morning. 2 for breakfast?" "Yes, please," Richard said, relieved that she didn't make a big deal about the wheelchair. She led them to a corner table that had enough space for Tommy's wheelchair without making him feel like he was in the way. Richard was starting to relax when he realized he'd forgotten to bring the special utensils Tommy usually needed for eating. His heart sank. This was exactly the kind of thing the professional caregivers never forgot. "Dad, it's okay," Tommy said, noticing his father's worried expression. "I can try to use regular forks and spoons. We'll figure it out." Their waitress approached the table, and Richard was struck by her warm smile. She looked to be in her late 20s with kind eyes and an easy way about her. Her name tag read Maria. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, looking directly at Tommy first, then at Richard. "What can I get you to drink while you look at the menu?" "Can I have chocolate milk?" Tommy asked eagerly. "Of course. And for you, sir?" "Coffee would be great. Thank you," Richard said. As Maria walked away, Richard noticed she moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd been doing this job for a while, but there was something else about her. She had treated Tommy like any other customer, not speaking louder or slower, not using baby talk, just normal conversation. When she returned with their drinks, Tommy was struggling a bit with the menu. His hands weren't quite steady enough to hold it at the right angle, and he was getting frustrated. "The print is pretty small on these menus," Maria said casually, pulling out a small pair of reading glasses from her apron pocket. "I need these myself sometimes. Would you like me to tell you about our breakfast specials instead?" She described the pancakes, eggs, and bacon in a way that made everything sound delicious, asking Tommy questions about what he liked and didn't like. Richard watched in amazement as his son engaged in normal conversation with a stranger for the first time in months. "I love pancakes," Tommy said, "but sometimes they're hard to cut. Our chef makes them extra fluffy," Maria said with a wink. "And I'll make sure to ask him to make them in smaller pieces. Would that help?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically. Richard ordered eggs and toast, touched by this simple act of thoughtfulness. When their food arrived, Richard tensed up again. This was always the hardest part. Tommy's motor skills made eating challenging, and Richard had seen too many people stare or make comments when his son struggled with utensils or accidentally spilled something. Tommy picked up his fork and tried to cut a piece of pancake, but his hand shook and he dropped the fork. His face immediately turned red with embarrassment. "It's okay, buddy," Richard said quickly, reaching over to help. But before he could take over, Maria appeared at their table. She had noticed what happened from across the diner. "You know what?" she said to Tommy, sitting down next to him for a moment. "My little girl has the same problem sometimes. Her hands get shaky when she's excited about food, especially when it's something as delicious as pancakes." She picked up Tommy's fork and showed him a different way to hold it. "Try gripping it like this, more with your whole hand instead of just your fingers. Sometimes that gives you more control." Tommy tried her suggestion, and while it wasn't perfect, he managed to get a bite of pancake to his mouth successfully. His face broke into a huge smile. "That's much better," Maria said. "You've got it now." What happened next surprised Richard even more. Instead of rushing away to help other customers, Maria stayed for a few more minutes, chatting with Tommy about school, his favorite subjects, and what he liked to do for fun. She listened to his answers carefully, even though his speech wasn't always perfectly clear. "I like computer games," Tommy said, "and I'm really good at strategy games because I have lots of time to think." "That's awesome," Maria said. "My daughter loves games too. She says the thinking games are the best because you get to use your brain instead of just your reflexes." Richard watched this interaction with growing amazement. Maria wasn't just being polite or professionally kind. She was genuinely interested in getting to know Tommy as a person. She asked follow-up questions, laughed at his jokes, and treated him with the same respect she would give any other customer. When other tables needed attention, Maria excused herself, but she kept checking back on them throughout the meal. Each time she stopped by, she had something encouraging to say to Tommy, or would ask him another question about his interests. By the time they finished eating, Tommy was more animated and talkative than Richard had seen him in months. He was sitting up straighter in his wheelchair, making eye contact with Maria and even cracking jokes. As they prepared to leave, Maria brought Tommy a small container. "I asked the chef to pack you some extra pancakes for later," she said. "And I wrote down that trick with the fork in case you want to remember it." Tommy beamed. "Thank you. This was the best breakfast ever." "You're very welcome," Maria said. "I hope you'll come back and visit us again soon." As Richard wheeled Tommy out to the car, his son couldn't stop talking about their waitress. "Dad, did you see how nice she was? She didn't treat me like I was weird or anything. She just helped me like it was no big deal." Richard nodded, but inside he was thinking about much more than just Maria's kindness. He was thinking about how long it had been since he'd seen his son this happy and confident, and he was wondering why a waitress at a small diner had been able to connect with Tommy in ways that expensive specialists never could. "Can we come back here tomorrow?" Tommy asked as they drove home. "I think that sounds like a great idea," Richard said, already planning their return trip. True to his word, Richard took Tommy back to Bella's kitchen the next morning, and the morning after that. What started as a simple breakfast outing quickly became the best part of both their days. By the third visit, Maria remembered exactly how Tommy liked his pancakes cut and which fork grip worked best for him. She would bring his chocolate milk without being asked and always had a cheerful greeting ready when they walked through the door. "There's my pancake expert," she would say, and Tommy would light up like Christmas morning. Richard found himself looking forward to these visits just as much as his son did. For the first time in years, he was watching Tommy interact naturally with someone outside their family. More importantly, he was seeing sides of his son that had been hidden away for too long. During their fourth visit, Richard noticed something that made him pause. At the table next to them sat an elderly man who was eating alone. His hands were shaking badly as he tried to drink his coffee, and he looked embarrassed when he spilled some on his shirt. Without missing a beat, Maria walked over with a warm towel and helped him clean up. She didn't make a big production of it or speak loudly, like he couldn't hear. She just treated it as a normal part of her job, the same way she helped Tommy with his eating challenges. "Coffee cups can be tricky sometimes," she said with a smile. "Would you like me to bring you a cup with a different handle? Some of them are easier to grip." The old man's face showed such relief and gratitude. Richard realized that Maria's kindness wasn't something special she reserved just for Tommy. This was simply who she was as a person. Over the following weeks, Richard began to notice more details about their waitress. Her uniform was always clean but clearly well worn and mended in a few places. She worked the morning shift, then would rush off somewhere else, still wearing her comfortable shoes and looking tired. One morning, Richard overheard Maria talking to another waitress about picking up extra shifts. "I can work lunch if Janet calls in sick again," Maria was saying. "I need the hours." "Don't you have that other job at night?" the coworker asked. "Yeah, but Sophie needs new school supplies and her therapy sessions aren't cheap." Richard's ears perked up at the mention of therapy. He pretended to read his newspaper, while listening more carefully. "How's she doing with the new therapist?" the coworker continued. "Better, I think. It's hard to tell sometimes. She's so smart, but the autism makes school really challenging for her. The other kids don't always understand why she acts different." Maria's voice had a tired edge to it that Richard hadn't heard before. "You're doing everything you can," her coworker said supportively. "I just want her to have the same chances as other kids, you know? But these specialists cost so much and insurance barely covers anything." Richard felt his heart sink. Here was this woman who showed such natural understanding and patience with Tommy, and she was struggling with her own child's special needs. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had all the money in the world to get Tommy the best care, while Maria was working multiple jobs just to afford basic therapy for her daughter. A few days later, Richard's curiosity got the better of him. He arrived at the diner earlier than usual and saw Maria in the parking lot, helping a young girl out of an old, beaten-up car. The girl looked to be around 8 years old with Maria's same warm eyes but a more serious expression. "Mama, I don't want to go to school today," the girl was saying. The other kids stare at me when I do my counting thing. I know, baby, Maria said gently, kneeling down to her daughter's level. But remember what we practiced? When you need to count, you can do it quietly to yourself, or you can ask your teacher for a quick break. But what if I mess up again? Then you try again tomorrow. That's what brave girls do. They keep trying. Richard watched as Maria walked her daughter to the school entrance, taking extra time to make sure she felt ready for the day. He could see the love and patience in every gesture, the same qualities she showed Tommy every morning. When Maria returned to work, she had her usual smile ready, but Richard could see the worry in her eyes. She was carrying the weight of her own parenting challenges while still managing to make every customer feel special. That morning, Tommy was having one of his more difficult days. His muscles were tighter than usual, making everything harder. He dropped his fork twice and knocked over his orange juice, sending it splashing across the table and onto the floor. Richard saw his son's face crumple with frustration and embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm being clumsy today." Before Richard could respond, Maria appeared with a mop and some towels. But instead of just cleaning up the mess, she sat down next to Tommy. "You know what?" she said conspiratorially. "I bet I can tell you exactly what happened here." Tommy looked up at her with curious eyes. "Your hands are probably feeling extra wobbly today, right? Like they're not listening to your brain properly?" Tommy nodded, surprised that she understood so precisely. "My daughter has days like that too. Her brain works so hard processing everything around her that sometimes her body gets confused. On those days, we use different tricks to make things easier." She showed Tommy how to anchor his elbow on the table for more stability and suggested using a straw for his drinks. Simple adjustments that made an immediate difference. "Some days our bodies cooperate better than others," she explained. "That doesn't mean we're doing anything wrong. It just means we need to be a little more creative." Richard watched his son's shoulders relax. The shame and frustration melted away, replaced by determination to try Maria's suggestions. As the weeks passed, Richard found himself arriving earlier and staying later at the diner, fascinated by Maria's natural ability to connect with people. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of what everyone needed. There was the businessman who always seemed stressed, and Maria would ask about his family, helping him remember what was important. The young mother with twins who looked overwhelmed got extra patience and help carrying things to her car. The construction workers who came in for lunch got hearty meals and friendly banter that made them laugh. But it was her interactions with Tommy that truly amazed Richard. She remembered everything Tommy told her about his interests and would bring him little things that connected to their conversations. A comic book someone had left behind that featured his favorite superhero. A newspaper article about a new video game she thought he'd find interesting. Most importantly, she helped Tommy feel capable and confident. She would ask for his help with small tasks like organizing the sugar packets or choosing which music should play in the diner. These simple requests made Tommy feel useful and included rather than like someone who always needed help. Richard began to understand that what Tommy needed wasn't just professional care or expensive equipment. He needed someone who saw his potential instead of just his limitations. Someone who understood that having special needs didn't mean being less than whole. One morning, Richard overheard Maria on her phone during her break. She was sitting in her car, and he couldn't help but notice the worry in her voice. "I understand the therapy costs more now, but Sophie really needs these sessions," she was saying. "Is there any way we can work out a payment plan?" There was a long pause. "I see. How much time do I have to come up with the full amount?" Another pause, and Richard could see her shoulders slump. "Okay. I'll figure something out. Thank you." She sat in her car for a few more minutes, her head in her hands. Richard could see the exhaustion and stress she usually kept hidden behind her cheerful demeanor. When she came back inside, her smile was in place. But Richard could tell it was harder to maintain than usual. Still, she greeted Tommy with the same warmth and attention she always showed him. "How's my favorite customer today?" she asked, ruffling Tommy's hair gently. "I'm good. Dad and I were talking about maybe coming for lunch sometime too. Would you be here? I wish I could be, Maria said honestly. But I work somewhere else during lunch, maybe on weekends though. Richard realized that Maria was working multiple jobs, trying to provide for her daughter while dealing with many of the same challenges he faced with Tommy. The difference was that she was doing it without any of the resources he took for granted. That night, after Tommy was asleep, Richard sat in his study thinking about everything he'd observed over the past few weeks. Maria had given Tommy something precious: confidence, joy, and a sense of normalcy. She had shown Richard what genuine care and understanding looked like. Now he was beginning to see that maybe there was a way he could give something back. Not just money, though that was part of it, but an opportunity for Maria to use her natural gifts in a way that could help both their families. The idea that was forming in his mind felt both scary and exciting. It would mean taking a big step outside his comfort zone. But watching Tommy flourish under Maria's care had shown him that the best solutions often came from the most unexpected places. Richard's curiosity about Maria's life grew stronger each day. It wasn't nosiness that drove him, but genuine concern for someone who had become so important to his son's happiness. He began to notice things he'd missed before: the way she would glance at her watch when her shift was ending, the tired lines around her eyes that her smile couldn't quite hide, and how she would sometimes pause and take a deep breath before greeting the next customer. One evening, Richard decided to drive past the diner after closing time. He told himself he was just taking a different route home, but deep down he knew he wanted to understand more about Maria's world. What he saw surprised him. The diner was dark except for a single light in the back. Through the window he could see Maria sitting at one of the tables surrounded by papers. She was still wearing her uniform from the morning shift, but now she had reading glasses on and was working on what looked like homework or bills. Her old car was one of only 2 vehicles left in the parking lot. The other belonged to Frank, the night security guard for the small shopping plaza. Richard parked across the street and watched, feeling a bit guilty for spying but unable to look away. Maria had her phone pressed to her ear, and even from a distance, Richard could see the stress on her face. She was gesturing with one hand while holding papers in the other. After she hung up, she put her head in her hands for a long moment. The next morning at breakfast, Maria seemed more tired than usual. Her smile was still there, but it took more effort. When Tommy asked her how she was doing, she gave her standard cheerful response, but Richard noticed she avoided making eye contact. "Mama, I made this for you at school," came a small voice from behind them. Richard turned to see a young girl approaching their table. She had Maria's dark hair and serious eyes, and she was carrying a crayon drawing. This had to be Sophie. "Oh, honey, what are you doing here?" Maria asked, clearly surprised and a bit flustered. "You're supposed to be at the after-school program. Mrs. Johnson said they had to close early today because the heat wasn't working," Sophie explained. "She called you, but you didn't answer, so she brought me here." Maria quickly checked her phone and saw several missed calls. "I'm so sorry, baby. I had my phone on silent because it was busy this morning." Richard watched the interaction with interest. Sophie seemed well-behaved but had an intensity about her that reminded him of Tommy. She handed her mother the drawing, which showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "That's us," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "The rainbow means good things are coming." Maria's eyes filled with tears for just a moment before she blinked them away. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Thank you." "Can I sit here while you work?" Sophie asked. "I brought my book." Maria looked around the busy diner, clearly torn. Having her daughter there wasn't ideal, but she couldn't leave work early and she had nowhere else for Sophie to go. "Of course," Maria said. "But you need to stay right here at this table, okay? And use your quiet voice." Richard was struck by how polite and mature Sophie seemed for an 8-year-old. She sat down with her book and began reading silently, occasionally looking up to watch the people around her with curious eyes. When Maria brought Tommy his pancakes, Sophie looked up from her book. "Hi," she said simply to Tommy. "I'm Sophie. That's my mom." "Hi, Sophie, I'm Tommy. Your mom is really nice. She helps me eat when my hands get shaky. Sophie nodded seriously. My hands get shaky sometimes too, especially when I'm nervous. And sometimes I have to count things or arrange them in order. Does that ever happen to you? Richard was amazed by how directly she spoke about her differences. There was no shame or embarrassment, just honest communication. Not exactly, Tommy said. But my muscles don't always do what my brain tells them to do. It's frustrating sometimes. Yeah, Sophie agreed. But my mom says our brains just work in special ways. She says it makes us good at things other people aren't good at. Richard watched this conversation between the two children with fascination. They were connecting over their shared experiences in a way that was both innocent and profound. Over. The following days, Sophie appeared at the diner more often. Richard learned that the after-school program had been having problems with staffing and funding, leaving Maria scrambling to find childcare. Sometimes Sophie would do homework at a corner table. Other times she would help her mother with small tasks like refilling napkin dispensers. Richard noticed that Sophie had some of the same challenges Tommy faced, just different ones. She would sometimes repeat certain actions several times, like arranging the salt and pepper shakers in perfect lines. She was clearly very intelligent, but social situations seemed to require extra effort for her. One afternoon, Richard overheard a difficult conversation between Maria and another mother from Sophie's school. I'm just saying, the other woman was speaking loudly enough for half the diner to hear. Maybe Sophie would be happier in a special school. She's been disrupting my daughter's class with all her behaviors. Maria's face went red, but she kept her voice calm and professional. Sophie is doing very well in her current school. Her teacher says she's one of the brightest students they've ever had. Book smart, maybe, the woman continued rudely. But she's not normal. My daughter says Sophie talks to herself and does weird things with her hands. Richard saw Maria's jaw tighten, but she still maintained her composure. Sophie is perfectly normal. She just processes information differently than some other children. I'm sorry, but I need to get back to work now. The woman left with a huff, but Richard could see how much the interaction had hurt Maria. She went into the kitchen for a few minutes, probably to collect herself, and when she came back out, her eyes were slightly red. That evening, Richard decided to stay later than usual. He wanted to understand more about Maria's situation, and he was beginning to form an idea that might help everyone involved. As closing time approached, the diner emptied out except for Richard, Tommy, and Sophie, who was finishing her homework. At their table, Maria was cleaning up and preparing to close, moving quickly through her routine. Mom, Sophie said quietly, that lady today was mean to you about me. Maria stopped wiping down tables and came over to sit with her daughter. Don't worry about her, baby. Some people just don't understand that everyone's brain works a little differently. Am I making things hard for you? Sophie asked, and Richard's heart broke a little at the serious concern in such a young voice. Oh, honey, no, Maria said, pulling her daughter close. You are the best thing in my whole life. You make everything better, not harder. But the therapy costs a lot of money and you have to work extra jobs and people say mean things. Sophie, look at me, Maria said gently. I would work 100 jobs if that's what it took to make sure you get everything you need. You are worth everything to me. Do you understand? Sophie nodded, but Richard could see she was still carrying worry that no 8-year-old should have to bear. After they left, Richard stayed behind, pretending to finish his coffee while Maria completed her closing duties. She was moving more slowly now, and he could see exhaustion in every step. Her phone rang and Richard couldn't help but overhear her side of the conversation. Yes, I understand the payment is late, she was saying quietly. I'm doing everything I can to catch up. No, please don't cancel her sessions. She's making such good progress. There was a long pause. How much time can you give me? 3 days, Okay, I'll figure something out. She hung up and sat down heavily at one of the clean tables, surrounded by the quiet diner. Richard watched through the window as she pulled out a calculator and a pile of bills. She was writing numbers on a napkin, adding and subtracting, trying to make impossible math work out. Her shoulders began to shake, and Richard realized she was crying. Not the dramatic tears of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, desperate crying of someone who was completely overwhelmed and had nowhere else to turn. She sat there for maybe 10 minutes, letting herself feel the weight of everything she was carrying. Then she wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and started putting the bills away. Even in her private moment of despair, she was already pulling herself together to face another day. Richard drove home that night with a heavy heart and a clear sense of purpose. He had witnessed something that changed everything for him. Here was a woman who possessed exactly the qualities Tommy needed: patience, understanding, genuine care, and the ability to see potential instead of problems. She was working herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her own special needs child, while naturally giving his son the kind of attention that money couldn't buy. The solution that was forming in his mind wasn't just about helping Maria financially, though that was part of it. It was about creating a situation where her natural gifts could flourish, where she could use her understanding and compassion in a way that helped both their families. But he also knew he had to be careful. Maria was proud and independent. She wouldn't accept charity, and he didn't want to offend her by making it seem like he was trying to buy her friendship or Tommy's happiness. The idea needed to be presented as what it truly was: an opportunity that would benefit everyone involved. Maria would get the stability and income she needed to care for Sophie properly. Tommy would get the understanding and companionship that had. Richard spent the entire weekend thinking about what he had witnessed at the diner. He couldn't get the image of Maria crying over her bills out of his mind, or the way Sophie had asked if she was making things hard for her mother. Most of all, he kept thinking about how natural and happy Tommy had become around both of them. On Monday morning, Richard made an unusual decision. Instead of going straight to the diner with Tommy, he asked his son to wait in the car while he went inside, alone. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Tommy asked, looking worried. "Everything's fine, buddy. I just need to talk to Maria about something grown up. I'll be right back." Richard found Maria refilling the coffee station. She looked surprised to see him without. "Tommy." "Good morning. Where's my favorite customer today?" she asked with her usual warm smile. "He's in the car. Actually, I was hoping I could talk to you privately for a few minutes. Do you have a moment?" Maria glanced around the diner. It was still early and not too busy yet. "Sure, let me just tell Jake I'm taking a quick break." They sat at a quiet corner table, and Richard suddenly felt more nervous than he had before any business presentation in his life. He had rehearsed this conversation all weekend, but now that the moment was here, he wasn't sure how to begin. "Maria, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll hear me out completely before you respond." She nodded, looking curious but a bit cautious. "Over the past few weeks, I've watched you with Tommy. You have a natural gift for understanding children with special needs. You see Tommy as a whole person, not just someone with challenges. You've given him confidence and joy that I haven't seen in years." Maria smiled softly. "Tommy's a wonderful kid. It's easy to connect with him." "That's exactly my point," Richard continued. "What you do naturally, most people have to study for years to learn. I've hired professional caregivers and therapists, spent thousands of dollars, and none of them understood Tommy the way you do instinctively." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I also know that you're struggling financially. I've overheard some of your phone calls, and I've seen how hard you're working to provide for Sophie's therapy and care." Maria's face immediately stiffened. "I appreciate your concern, but my financial situation isn't really your business." "You're absolutely right," Richard said quickly. "I'm not bringing this up to embarrass you or to offer charity. I'm bringing it up because I have a proposition that I think could help both our families." Maria remained quiet, but she didn't get up and leave, which Richard took as a good sign. "I want to offer you a job. Not just any job, but one that would use your natural abilities and pay you what you're really worth." "What kind of job?" Maria asked carefully. "I'd like you to be Tommy's companion and tutor. You would help him with daily activities, educational support, and social development. But this wouldn't be like hiring a traditional caregiver. You would be working with someone who already trusts you and enjoys spending time with you." Maria was quiet for a moment, processing what he was saying. The position would come with a full salary, more than you're making working multiple jobs, plus health insurance that would cover both you and Sophie. It would also include educational benefits, because I'd want you to finish the degree you started in special education. Maria's eyes widened. How do you know about that? Tommy mentioned that you told him you studied child development before Sophie was born. I did some research and found out about your college records. You were studying to become a special education teacher before circumstances forced you to leave school. I couldn't afford to continue, Maria said quietly. Sophie needed so much care and therapy, and I had to work. I understand. But this position would allow you to complete your education while gaining practical experience with Tommy. You could attend classes during times when he's at his other therapies or when I'm available to be with him. Maria shook her head slowly. This sounds too good to be true. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? Richard leaned forward earnestly. Because in the past month I've learned something important. Tommy doesn't just need professional care. He needs someone who genuinely cares about him as a person, someone who sees his potential instead of his limitations. You've already given him more progress and happiness than years of expensive therapy. He paused, then continued more softly. And because I recognize a good parent when I see one, you're doing everything you can for Sophie, just like I'm trying to do everything I can for Tommy. Maybe we can help each other. Maria was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded on the table. What about Sophie? She finally asked. I can't just leave her in after-school programs that keep closing down. I've thought about that too, Richard said. There's an excellent private school not far from where I live. They have an outstanding special education program in small class sizes. Sophie could attend there, and the tuition would be part of your benefits package. I can't accept charity, Maria said firmly. This isn't charity, Richard insisted. This is a job offer. You would be earning every penny by helping Tommy reach his potential. I've seen how much progress he's made just from having breakfast with you every day. Imagine what you could accomplish working with him regularly. Maria looked out the window where Tommy was waiting in the car. He had his face pressed against the glass, making silly faces at her. She laughed despite herself. He really is a special kid, she said. He is. And he deserves someone who sees that specialness instead of just his disability. You're that person, Maria. I would need to think about this, Maria said. It's a big decision. Of course, take all the time you need. But I want you to know that this offer comes from a place of respect, not pity. I believe you have skills and insights that could make a real difference in Tommy's life, and I want to make it possible for you to use those gifts. Just then, Tommy appeared at the diner door looking impatient. Dad, are you coming? I'm hungry for pancakes. Maria smiled and waved at him. Your son is definitely not patient when it comes to breakfast. No, he's not, Richard laughed. Should we continue this conversation later? You can think about what I've said. Yes, I'd like that. Thank you for seeing me as more than just a waitress. Thank you for seeing Tommy as more than just his disability. The next few days were difficult for Richard. He tried to act normal during their breakfast visits, but he found himself watching Maria's face for any sign of what she might be thinking. Tommy, oblivious to the adult conversations happening around him, continued to enjoy his morning routine. On Thursday morning, Maria approached their table with a more serious expression than usual. Richard, could we talk again after breakfast? I've made my decision. Richard's heart pounded. Of course. After Tommy finished eating, Richard walked him out to the car and explained that he needed a few more minutes to talk with Maria. Tommy was happy to wait, especially since Maria had given him a new comic book to look at. Back inside, Maria sat across from Richard with her hands folded on the table. I've been thinking about your offer all week, she began. And I've talked to Sophie about it too. Richard held his breath. I want to accept, but I have some conditions. Relief flooded through Richard. Name them. First, this has to be a real job with real expectations. I don't want to feel like I'm accepting charity disguised as work. Absolutely. I'll have a proper employment contract drawn up with clear responsibilities and performance expectations. Second, if it doesn't work out, If Tommy doesn't respond well to having me around more, or if I'm not as good at this as you think I'll be, we need to be able to end the arrangement without hard feelings. That's fair, though I'm not worried about it. Third, Sophie comes first. If she needs me for something important, I need to know I can be there for her. Of course. That's part of what makes you a good parent and why I think you'll be great. With Tommy, Maria took a deep breath. Then yes, I accept your offer. Richard felt like cheering, but he kept his response professional. I'm very glad. When would you like to start? I need to give proper notice here at the diner. 2 weeks? That's perfect. It'll give me time to get everything arranged on my end. They shook hands across the table, and Richard felt like they were embarking on something that would change all their lives for the better. 6 months later, Richard sat in his study looking at a photo from Tommy's birthday party. In the picture, Tommy and Sophie were laughing together while Maria helped them both blow out candles. Tommy looked confident and happy, in a way Richard had almost forgotten was possible. Maria had not only exceeded his expectations as Tommy's companion and tutor, but she had brought a warmth and normalcy to their home that had been missing since Linda died. She was halfway through her degree program and thriving in her studies. Sophie was flourishing in her new school, making friends and excelling academically. But the best part was watching the genuine friendship that had developed between the two children. They understood each other in ways that transcended their different challenges. Tommy helped Sophie when social situations felt overwhelming, and Sophie helped Tommy when his physical limitations made him frustrated. Richard had learned something valuable through this experience. Sometimes, the best solutions come, not from spending more money or finding fancier experts, but from recognizing the extraordinary in ordinary people.